It began in the heart of Europe, a gunshot in Sarajevo that set the world on fire. Empires clashed, millions perished, and maps were redrawn forever. But far across the Atlantic, the United States stood still, watching, waiting, debating. Why should America bleed for a war that wasn't its own? But then, everything changed. A sunken ship, a secret message, and a threat that reached American shores forced the nation to rise. This is the untold story of how World War I not only changed the world, but awakened a sleeping giant. It began not with an army, nor with a declaration, but with a single gunshot fired on a quiet morning in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist affiliated with the Black Hand, a secret organization pushing for Slavic independence from Austro-Hungarian rule. At first glance, it may have seemed like a tragic yet localized event, a royal figure killed by a fanatic in a tense corner of the Balkans. But in reality, that shot echoed far beyond the cobbled streets of Sarajevo. It was the match that struck a world drenched in political tension, military alliances, and imperial ambition. Europe in 1914 was a continent teetering on the edge. The major powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain, were bound together in a complex web of treaties and alliances, all wary of one another, all stockpiling weapons, all preparing for a war that many believed was inevitable. Nationalism was rising in nearly every corner, particularly in the Balkans, where the Ottoman Empire's decline had left a power vacuum, and Slavic nationalism clashed fiercely with imperial interests. Militarism had become a dominant force in statecraft, with nations glorifying their armed forces and planning for conflict even in times of peace. So when Franz Ferdinand was killed, it wasn't merely a loss for Austria-Hungary, it was an international crisis. Within weeks, the machinery of war began to turn. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, where the assassin had connections. Serbia, supported by Russia, resisted the demands. As diplomacy faltered, mobilizations began. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. When German troops violated Belgium's neutrality to attack France, Britain entered the war. In less than 2 months, the entire European continent was engulfed. What made this descent into chaos so swift was not just the alliances, but the mindset of the time. War was still viewed through a 19th century lens, as a brief, glorious affair that would resolve political disputes and affirm national greatness. Few anticipated the brutality that was to come, the trenches, the gas, the mechanized slaughter. The leaders who declared war in 1914 did so with confidence. They believed they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they unleashed a nightmare. That single shot in Sarajevo revealed the fragility of peace in a world built on pride, competition, and fear. It showed how deeply interconnected the fates of nations had become. A regional assassination had sparked a global war. Not because the event itself demanded it, but because the world had already been primed for combustion. The spark was small, but the powder keg was vast, and once ignited, the flames would consume millions, reshape borders, topple empires, and alter the course of history forever. Sarajevo wasn't just the beginning of a war. It was the end of an era. By 1914, Europe was a continent balanced on a knife's edge. The assassination in Sarajevo would become the spark, but the ground had been laid for years, perhaps even decades. Every major power was tangled in a complicated system of treaties and alliances, each promising mutual defense in the event of war. On paper, these agreements were meant to keep the peace. In practice, They created a situation where the smallest conflict could trigger a chain reaction across the entire continent. Germany was bound to Austria-Hungary, France to Russia, and Britain to Belgium. It was a web so tight that if one strand snapped, the entire structure would collapse. This was not an era of trust. Each nation eyed its rivals with suspicion, measuring its own strength not just against one enemy, but against a potential coalition of enemies. The result was a Europe where fear and pride intertwined in dangerous ways. Nationalism was rising like a tide across the continent, especially in regions where diverse ethnic groups lived under a single flag. Nowhere was this more explosive than in the Balkans, a region long described as the powder keg of Europe. The decline of the Ottoman Empire had left behind a fractured landscape, with newly independent nations competing for territory and influence, and great powers meddling to secure their own interests. Serbia dreamed of uniting all South Slavs under its leadership, a vision that directly threatened Austria-Hungary's hold on its Slavic territories. Austria-Hungary, already struggling to manage its patchwork of ethnic groups, feared that Serbian nationalism could inspire unrest within its own borders. This tension was more than political. It was personal, rooted in identity, history, and a shared sense of destiny. While nationalism stirred the hearts of the people, militarism captured the minds of their leaders. Across Europe, military speed and soared. Nations competed to build bigger armies, faster ships, and deadlier weapons. Generals were not just advisors, they were celebrities, their plans for mobilization and offense discussed with the same excitement as political speeches. War was no longer seen as a last resort. For many, it was an acceptable, even desirable, way to assert dominance, settle disputes, and prove national strength. The press often glorified military power, portraying it as a symbol of progress and patriotism. The idea that a great war might be short, decisive, and heroic was widespread, blinding many to the horrors that modern technology would soon unleash. The alliances that linked Europe's powers together created a dangerous illusion of security. France trusted in Russia, Russia trusted in France, Germany trusted in Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary trusted in Germany. Britain believed that its naval supremacy could shield it from the worst. Each nation imagined that its friends would stand firm and its enemies would hesitate. But this trust was a trap because it meant that when one nation moved toward war, its allies would follow, not out of choice, but out of obligation. Diplomacy became less about avoiding war and more about preparing for the one everyone believed was inevitable. The mood in 1914 was one of restless readiness. Military timetables were drawn up with precision, mobilization plans rehearsed like clockwork. In Germany, the famous Schlieffen Plan detailed the rapid invasion of France through Belgium in the event of war with Russia. In Russia, vast mobilization schedules aimed to overwhelm the Central Powers before they could fully prepare. These were not plans for defensive struggles. They were blueprints for rapid offensive action. The irony was that the very speed and rigidity of these plans made war more likely. Once mobilization began, it was almost impossible to stop without risking disaster. Europe had built a machine that, once set in motion, could not be turned off. And beneath all this was a sense of competition that went far beyond polit. The summer of 1914 was deceptively calm on the surface. Tourists filled the cafes of Paris, the streets of London bustled with trade, and Vienna's music halls echoed with waltzes. Yet beneath the elegance and order lay a continent where political rivalries, nationalist ambitions, and military pride had been brewing into a volatile mixture. All it needed was a spark. And when that spark came, in the form of a single gunshot in Sarajevo, it would ignite not just the Balkans, not just Central Europe, but the entire world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not, in itself, a declaration of war, but it set in motion a chain of events that seemed almost unstoppable once they began. Austria-Hungary, humiliated and determined to assert its authority, placed the blame squarely on Serbia. Fueled by the belief that Serbian nationalism was a direct threat to its empire, Vienna decided to confront the issue head-on. But Austria-Hungary was cautious. It knew that attacking Serbia could draw in Russia, Serbia's powerful Slavic ally. So, before acting, it sought the reassurance of its own most important partner, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II, eager to see Austria-Hungary take decisive action and confident in his nation's military strength, offered what came to be known as the blank check, unconditional support, even if it meant war with Russia. With German backing secured, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914. The terms were intentionally harsh, designed less as an invitation to negotiate and more as a pretext for war. Serbia, knowing that outright refusal would almost certainly mean invasion, accepted most of the demands, but rejected those that infringed upon its sovereignty. It was enough for Austria-Hungary to claim that Serbia had defied them. The diplomatic clock had run out. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the first domino fell. Russia, bound by its cultural and political ties to Serbia, began mobilizing its massive army in preparation for war against Austria-Hungary. Germany viewed this mobilization as an immediate threat. The German military command, following its meticulously timed war plans, decided it could not wait for Russia to strike first. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The web of alliances tightened, and another domino tipped. France, allied with Russia, now faced the prospect of fighting Germany. Germany, anticipating a two-front war, turned to the Schlieffen Plan, its strategy for quickly defeating France before Russia could fully mobilize. This plan required moving through Belgium to outflank French defenses. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and began its advance through Belgian territory. The violation of Belgium's neutrality was not just a military maneuver, it was the trigger that brought Britain into the conflict. Bound by treaty to protect Belgium and wary of a German-dominated Europe, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. What had begun as a localized dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia now drew in nearly every major European power in less than 2 weeks. Each declaration of war was not an isolated decision, but the inevitable outcome of years of alliances, military planning, and mutual suspicion. The dominoes had been carefully arranged long before Sarajevo. The assassination merely provided the push that sent them tumbling in rapid succession. By mid-August, Europe was engulfed in war, with armies mobilizing across the continent, leaders speaking of honor and destiny, and millions marching off to what many still believed would be a quick and decisive conflict. They could not yet imagine the years of stalemate, destruction, and death that lay ahead, only that the machinery of war was now fully in motion, and there was no turning back. In the summer of 1914, the leaders of Europe stepped into war with a confidence that now seems almost unimaginable. They saw war not as a disaster to be avoided at all costs, but as a test of strength, a proving ground for their nations, and in some cases, a necessary cleansing fire. This was a generation raised on the memory of past conflicts that, in their minds, had been swift and decisive. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had lasted just a matter of months. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had been short, bloody affairs, but over quickly. The idea that a modern European war might stretch into years and grind millions into the mud was beyond most imaginations. War was still dressed in the romantic colors of the 19th century. Parades, cavalry charges, gallant officers leading men into glory. It was a vision entirely unprepared for the brutal reality that awaited them. This mindset was not confined to military leaders alone. Politicians, journalists, and the general public shared the belief that their nation was destined to triumph, that its cause was just, and that its soldiers would be home by Christmas. Nationalism played its part here, fueling the idea that one's own country was superior in courage, discipline, and moral purpose. Newspapers published stirring editorials about duty and honor, accompanied by images of smiling recruits boarding trains. Young men enlisted in droves, not merely out of obligation, but out of genuine enthusiasm, afraid they might miss the great adventure if they waited too long. The atmosphere in the first weeks of mobilization was charged with energy, the kind that comes before a storm. Part of this misplaced optimism came from a profound misunderstanding of how much warfare had changed. Industrialization had transformed battlefields into killing grounds unlike anything seen before. Machine guns could mow down entire waves of infantry in seconds. Heavy artillery could destroy defenses from miles away. Barbed wire, trench systems, and rapid-fire rifles would make frontal assaults suicidal. Poison gas, soon to be unleashed, would add a new, terrifying dimension to combat. Yet in 1914, many generals still clung to outdated strategies based on speed, massed formations, and the belief that offensive spirit alone could overcome any obstacle. It was a fatal miscalculation. This overconfidence was reinforced by the rigid military timetables and war plans that had been developed over years of preparation. Once mobilization began, there was a sense that events could not be stopped. Leaders believed that hesitation would mean defeat, and so they pressed forward, even as diplomatic options dwindled. The machinery of war was in motion, and they saw no way, or perhaps no reason, to halt it. Pride, fear, and the belief in inevitable victory combined to shut down any last chances for peace. As the trains carried men to the front, there was laughter, singing, and waving from the windows. The soldiers did not yet know the reality that awaited them. The endless trenches, the mud that swallowed boots whole, the rats and disease, the constant thunder of artillery, the friends who would vanish in an instant under machine gun fire. They were marching toward history's first truly modern war, but they were doing so with the mindset of the past. The leaders had promised a quick, decisive victory. What they delivered was years of unrelenting slaughter, the collapse of empires, and a world forever changed. The gunshot in Sarajevo was a small sound in a small city, but its echo rolled across continents. On its own, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand might have remained a tragic regional event, the kind of crisis diplomats could resolve with stern letters and cautious agreements. But Europe in 1914 was not a place of calm negotiation. It was a place where decades of rivalry, ambition, and fear had been stored like dry tinder. The alliances, the militarism, the nationalism, all of it was already in place, waiting. The gun was merely the match. The world had been primed for combustion long before Gavrilo Princip took aim. The powder keg was vast and complex. It had been built over years of colonial competition, arms races, and political maneuvering. Each great power had its own vision for the future, and none were willing to step aside. Germany, eager to prove itself as an equal to Britain and France, saw the opportunity to expand its influence. Austria-Hungary, clinging to an empire threatened by nationalist movements, feared that inaction would mean disintegration. Russia, stretching from Europe into Asia, saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples and refused to let Serbia stand alone. France remembered the humiliation of losing territory to Germany in 1871 and longed for revenge. Britain watched uneasily from across the Channel, determined to maintain the balance of power. All of these ambitions and resentments existed before Sarajevo. The assassination simply lit the fuse. Once the fuse was burning, events moved with alarming speed. There was no single moment when the war could have been easily stopped. because each decision seemed logical in the context of the last. Austria-Hungary could not ignore what it saw as Serbian provocation. Germany could not risk losing Austria-Hungary as an ally. Russia could not abandon Serbia. France could not allow Russia to be defeated. Britain could not tolerate German troops in Belgium. Each step toward war was taken not with the expectation of disaster, but with the belief that victory was inevitable, and that backing down would mean dishonor. The fragility of peace became brutally clear. Diplomacy was too slow for the speed of mobilization. Pride was too strong for compromise. The machinery of war, built and maintained for years, clicked into place with terrifying precision. By the time the first battles were fought, the war was no longer about an archduke or a city or even a single act of violence. It had become a struggle for dominance, for survival, for the very shape of the future world. When the powder keg exploded, the destruction was beyond anything imagined. Millions of soldiers and civilians would die in trenches and fields, in towns reduced to rubble, in seas and skies turned into new battlefields. Empires that had ruled for centuries would collapse into history. Borders would shift, revolutions would rise, and the world would enter a new, uncertain age. The old order, the Europe of royal families, grand alliances, and polite diplomacy, was gone forever. That single shot in Sarajevo was the spark. But the fire that followed had been waiting, silent and invisible, in the rivalries and ambitions of nations. Once lit, it burned until there was nothing left to consume. The Great War was not just the beginning of a conflict. It was the end of an era. The First World War began with a single shot, but it ended by reshaping the world. It was not only a war of armies, but of nations' pride, fears, and ambitions colliding until the old order could no longer stand. In its wake, empires fell, borders shifted, and millions lay dead, not just from battle, but from hunger, disease, and displacement. The dream of a short, glorious conflict had dissolved into years of mud, blood, and despair. History often warns us that peace is fragile, that it is not built solely on treaties or promises, but on trust, restraint, and the willingness to compromise. In 1914, the world had none of these in enough measure, and so one spark in Sarajevo lit a fire that no one could control. The Great War was meant to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became a warning, a reminder that the causes of conflict often lie hidden, waiting for the smallest event to unleash the greatest of tragedies. That is why we remember 1914, not only to honor the dead, but to understand how quickly the world we know can disappear